Shout to Jehovah, all the earth. Serve ye Jehovah with gladness. Before him come with singing mirth. Know that Jehovah he God is. Is he that made us and not we? His folk and sheep of his feeding. Oh, with confession enter ye his gates, courtyards with praising. Confess to him, bless ye his name, because Jehovah he good is. His mercy ever is the same, and his faith unto all ages.
My name is Dan Fenn, and I've been involved in Lexington Remembers for quite a while now. I can't remember how many years Mary Gillespie could tell us. I want to welcome you to this very special edition of Lexington Remembers. It's particularly appropriate that we should be doing this show this year, because this is, of course, the 300th anniversary of the day in 1713 when Lexington became an independent, self-governing community, finally free of Cambridge after 70 years of that connection. This show is going to focus on the history of First Parish, the white church on the green. Now, it may seem sort of strange. What's that got to do with the founding of Lexington? Well, in fact, it has everything to do with the founding of Lexington, because for perhaps 150 years at the beginnings of this community, the church and the town were one. There was no such thing as the separation of church and state. First Parish was the only church in town, and as a matter of fact, strange as it may seem, there was an official committee appointed by the selectmen, reporting to the selectmen, whose job it was to determine who actually sat where in the meeting house during church services. And it's hard to believe, isn't it, that it was the town government that selected the minister, that hired the minister, that paid the minister with the funds generated from the taxpayers. So First Parish Lexington and the town of Lexington were the same thing for so many years, and we're going to talk about that connection in the early days, and why it existed, and how it finally ended in the course of this program. We're going to we turned to the History Committee of First Parish to mount this program for us, and the chair of that committee is Elaine Tirano. she's going to tell us what happened in 1692 in the 1600s, and she's going to be backstopped by Lexington's resident historian Sam Doran. Sam is a freshman at Wheaton. He learned his craft literally at the knee of the legendary Larry Whipple over the course of many years. And Sam is going to appear periodically telling us what the town was like, what was going on in the town and the community as a whole. You know, in those days, those early days, people sat for 4.5, 5 hours in church on Sundays, listening to what? Well, Reverend Peter Bolata, the parish minister here at First Parish, is going to tell us what was and how that changed over the years, how the services changed, how the theology changed of this institution that goes back over 300 years now. And Suzanne Jubenville, the music director of First Parish, what kind of music did people sing or participate in or listen to, and how has that changed over the years? And she's going to fill in that spot for us as we go along here. Reverend Helen Cohen, the beloved and distinguished minister emerita of First Parish, she's going to pick up the story in the 1700s, when the town and the church were dominated by two very important figures, the Reverend Thomas Hancock and, of course, the Reverend Jonas Clark. And then we'll move into the 1800s, and Bill Smith of the History Committee is going to talk. That was a very important and very exciting century when the separation of church and state took place in Massachusetts, and when First Parish became Unitarian instead of Congregational. And we'll hear from Peter and Suzanne and Sam about that period too. And then the 1900s, Elaine Turano is going to come back, fill us in on that. And then we're going to end up with Peter Bolata telling us how First Parish maintains its connections with its early days in 1692 and how it has evolved and changed and what the future looks like. So, welcome to the program, and let's begin. We thought that the Hancock-Clarke House would be the most appropriate place to start the story because it is so much a part of the history of First Parish and of course of the town. So thanks to the Lexington Historical Society, here we are in Hancock-Clarke in Jonas Clark's study. The house comes a little bit after the formation of the First Parish and its first minister, but we'll get to that. Sam, the story really starts, doesn't it, before 1692, when First Parish was, as they said in those days, gathered with the approval of the Great and General Court, the legislature of Massachusetts. They had to agree that a community could be a parish and could have its own church. But this really goes back before 1692.
Certainly. In 1636, the first land was granted out here by the proprietors in Cambridge The grant was made to one of the Harlarkenden family on the condition that he improve the land or build a house out here and settle it either with his own family or with a caretaker family. He failed to do so. The land was repossessed and granted again, this time to his brother. And the brother was intent on carrying out his duties with the land, but alas, he died fairly shortly thereafter. And this time the land passed to a fellow named Pelham, a relative of Lord de la Warr, the name of Delaware coming from that, and he settles a family out here by the name of Muzzy, and that's in 1642 that this first house is built at the site of today's Edison Station, right there on Mass Ave, corner of Grant Street. And the Muzzies come out here from Rumney Marsh, which is now Chelsea and Revere, and they build this small home, and their descendants were still living here up until the 70s or 80s.
The Muzzies, and a very famous name here, and of course, given the historian, pretty famous around the country. So this is these lands here are a part of Cambridge, then.
Right, and Cambridge at that point extending all the way up through Bedford and Billerica, and including Lexington, Arlington, and Newton and other communities. It was an expansive town, for sure. And at the same time, the Cambridge farms here came out of a need for farmland from Cambridge filling up so fast with settlers from across the pond, if you will, and they needed a place for pasturage and hay, and so for some years before 1642, that's what this land had been used for.
So it was called Cambridge Farms, and one of the reasons, I guess, that the settlers in Cambridge needed this land out here was because in those days, to have a working family farm, you had to have at least 40 acres. You needed pasturage, you needed some space for the kitchen garden. 40 acres was kind of the minimum. And so with these immigration, this rapid immigration in the early 1600s, they just needed more space.
Certainly,
right?
yeah.
So then more and more families moved out here.
Mm-hmm. And by 1775, there were 750 or so families living in what by that point was Lexington.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it happens in 1713. So now, what is all this business about having their own church? What's all that about? How many people were looking for that?
Well, it became quite a burden to have to go into Cambridge for meeting every Sunday. And so the people out here in Cambridge Farms started to want their own minister, their own meeting house, their own parish. And up until this point, they had just been the farms, kind of out here on the outskirts of Cambridge, but they really wanted to be their own precinct and their own parish.
Okay, and actually that's happening all over the area. Concord has a lot of fringe areas too, splitting off and wanting their own. And so Elaine, what did they do about it? These people wanted their own church.
Well, after they petitioned twice in 10 years, they finally got it approved.
And by the Great General Court
of Cambridge.
And Charlie, you've got some information on what was holding us up.
Yes, it was a long process, and there were some delays that are hard to explain now, although one can guess at the reasons for them. The first record we have it comes from 1682, when the farmers of Lexington presented of Cambridge presented a petition to the General Court, asking for the right to separate themselves as a parish, not as a community, not as a town, from Cambridge, so that they could continue to pay Cambridge all the taxes they paid before, but they would build a meeting house and support their own minister. The one Cambridge expense that they wouldn't pay was that they wouldn't continue paying for the upkeep of the minister in Cambridge. They said in the petition that they had several times asked Cambridge for permission for this, but they got no encouragement, and that's why they were bringing it to the General Court. The General Court looked at it and said, well, we've got to consider this next year because we've got to give Cambridge a chance to respond. So Cambridge submitted its own petition, and it was heartrending. They said this is going to ruin Cambridge. Cambridge had a rough time. They had the town of Newton had separated from Cambridge, and that had been going on for 10 years or so, I think, when this petition came up, and it was quite rancorous. And so the petition, the people of Cambridge, the Cambridge selectmen sent in 1683 sent a petition in to the General Court, and they said...
and the General Court is the legislature.
That's the legislature,
yes.
Yeah. And they said, because of the loss of Newton, we're greatly disenabled so comfortably to maintain our ministry and discharge our public charges as we want and ought to do, by reason one principal arm of our town is cut off, that would be Newton, and our accommodations for husbandry so poor and small, and our trade so little and inconsiderable, that it is even a wonder to ourselves how we do subsist and carry on public charges so well as we do, though we do it not so well as we should. And then they went on, if we have this arm cut off too, we shall be much disenabled to carry on God's work and support the ministry.
Boy, that's to start tears flowing.
Well, I know, you really feel it. You need a violin playing in the background. And the General Court took all this into consideration, and now they had two houses, the deputies and the magistrates. The deputies were elected, two representatives from each town in the colony, and the magistrates were an appointed house, appointed by the governor, and they perhaps were a little bit more connected with the establishment. At any rate, the deputies were all for granting this, but the magistrates were a little bit leery of it for a while, and they just stopped it that year, 1683. But they were concerned about not so much whether they should do it, but how they should divide the town from the parish. The new parish would take some people out of the tax base that was supporting the ministry, and so they said, let's draw the legislature had a committee appointed, and that took another year. 1684, the committee had reported, let's make the dividing line 5.5 miles from the meeting house in Cambridge. The magistrates were the first ones to respond to it, and they said, okay, let's do this, but let's make it 6 miles from the meeting house. The deputies said, no, we won't consent. And you had to have consent of both houses in order to get something done. It's still 1684, the magistrate said, after further consideration, let's make it 5.5 miles, as the committee said, but let's make it a 7-year trial, and after 7 years we can decide. And the deputy said, nope, we're sticking by our vote. So it wasn't done. It wasn't done until 92 rather. The 7-year delay. A lot of trouble things were happening in Massachusetts at that time. The Stuart kings were trying to get back the royal charter, which was allowing the colonists too much freedom, and there was some fear that if that happened, there would be economic hard times because the business arrangements would be set up in favor of the mother country in some way that would hurt people here. So Cambridge was worried about losing money that way. And then, of course, King James II came to the throne, no friend to the Puritans, and he tried to reorganize the whole politics of New England and sent a governor over here to govern not only what he called the Dominion of New England, included not only all the English settlements in what's now New England, but it also took in New York and New Jersey, and it was really unwieldy. Well, King James succumbed after only 3 years to the Glorious Revolution. And they had a little revolution here in Boston and locked up Sir Edmund Andros, the governor. And so they didn't get the whole charter business sorted out until 1691.
So a lot of other stuff going on
Yeah,
there.
that's right.
Besides our concern.
That's right.
Right.
And then they said, you know, when they finally gave an order in 1691 saying that it's okay to build your church, they said upon reading the petition of the farmers and inhabitants of the farms within the precincts and bounds of the town of Cambridge towards Concord, therein setting forth their distance, the nearest of them living above 5 miles from Cambridge Meeting House, the place of public worship, praying that, according to the former applications by them several years since made unto this court for the advantage of themselves, families, and posterity, they may have this court's favor and license in order to calling of a fit minister for dispensing the gospel among them, as also they may be a distinct village for the ends proposed in their said petition. So they were allowed to become a separate village within Cambridge. In one of the documents it says, for instance, that besides having a meeting house and supporting a minister, they could conduct their militia exercises separately from the town of Cambridge.
In addition to the parish.
Yeah, and they still went on. I mean, the colony was collecting taxes from Cambridge for all its citizens to support the general court, so they would have to keep paying that. They also had, at great expense, apparently built the bridge across the Charles, where the Anderson Bridge is now, between Harvard Square and Alston, and they insisted that the farmers pay a share of the upkeep on that. And since they couldn't get to Boston very well to sell their produce without using it, they probably should have done that. There was also a grammar school to support.
So it had all these details in the negotiations,
Yeah,
which ultimately produces
right after this.
What we know as the First Parish. And about how many families were there out here at the time that they petitioned so urgently for their own parish?
Well, there were about 30 families in town at the time that we can tell.
Uh-huh. Okay. And they were kind of scattered around.
Right. In fact, a lot of them were out near the outskirts of the towns. There wasn't as much concentration on the center of Lexington. A lot of times there would be families that overflowed from Woburn, perhaps, and so there were Locks and Blodgetts and families that became important in colonial Lexington that started out as Woburn families.
Okay. So Elaine, what happens now?
So 1692 comes, and great, the townspeople can have their own church and minister. So they promptly have Benjamin Estabrook.
And that's picked. He's picked by the town, not by the. Well, it's the same thing. The parish and the town's the same thing. Yeah.
And so at that point, they build him. They build a meeting house. I have a description of it, which will make you shiver when you think of the poor people sitting there in the cold.
They didn't have heating.
No heat, no.
No.
It was used for worship when only partially finished, a plain barn-like structure covered with rough boards and shingled roof without steeple or pane. The timbers were all exposed, rude benches extended across from the middle aisle and either side to the outer aisles. The men sat on one side and the women on the other, and the boys were on a bench so they could keep an eye on them. I guess they could be a little noisy. And there were galleries on 3 sides, and the upper galleries were added later. Some of the men of the town built their wives nice seats with backs on them, even though they couldn't.
And some didn't.
Yeah, some didn't.
Yeah. All right for them.
Yeah. So this was behind where that fountain is now, where
Where the statue is.
the statue is.
Okay.
It was situated there.
About where the pulpit rock is now on the corner.
Small building. Just small, plain,
There's-
wood building. And it served, as time went on, not just for church services, but for town meetings and to store the town's powder and musket ball and so on.
And somewhere in there, they made the first covenant too. That was an important part of establishing the
The
church.
covenant
It was-
between them.
the-
Okay.
Well, it was with God. That was basically how they thought of it, and they agreed to follow to adhere to the faith as put forth by the Synod of the Churches in Boston, and they said they would stand by it, maintain it, and if need be, contend for it. And they also, as Puritans would do, said that we're doing this in order thereunto for the better promoving of the settlement of the gospel among us and so forth, and says, knowing how prone we are to backslide, abjuring all confidence in ourselves and relying on the Lord Jesus Christ alone for help. So,
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's an interesting piece.
I'd like to say something about the Muzzy House before
Yeah,
we get on to
you
something
bet.
else. It's just an interesting little thing. Have you ever been in the old Muzzy House?
I have not.
Well, it was indeed moved from that area. It had to be cut in half and moved up to a hill behind there. And you can actually see where the house was cut in half to move it. And part of the house looks like 1800s fancy, and then another section of the house looks kind of like they had left it pretty much the way it was many hundreds of years ago.
And where are the two pieces?
Well, actually, worth noting that was the third house on the site at the Edison station there.
Oh, okay.
And so the first house was the 1642 first house in Lexington, and then that met some fate. We're not sure when or how. The Muzzies built a second house, and then they moved that one down Waltham Street, I believe. And then later it was moved again to Forest Street, where it's got a plaque on it today. And then that third house on the Edison Station site, the third Muzzy house, was built in the early 1800s. Then 1913, to make way for electricity in the Edison Station, they cut it in diagonally, as Elaine says, and they moved it up over the railroad tracks at the time, up Grant Street, and then up Glen Road South, which is probably the steepest road in all of Lexington. And that took about 2 weeks to move it to its current home. It's the Oberteufels' home today.
And it's there now. And what about the other piece? The other
Oh, they
piece?
were rejoined.
Yeah, it was
Oh, I see.
back together.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. So this first meeting house is a pretty unattractive building. And the first minister, Benjamin Estabrook, the town hired. How did they pay that fellow?
Well, they established the ministerial fund by buying this so-called ministerial land, and the wood that was cut off of it was sold, or he was also paid with cords of wood. And I think they had hay fields there too.
Okay, and this is town action
Right.
to select the minister and to pay him. What about housing?
Well, they built a house for him.
Okay, where was that?
Where was it?
It was about where the boiler room of the current Carey Memorial Building, Carey Hall, is today.
Okay,
Oh,
okay. So he was pretty well set up, this fellow.
Yeah,
Yeah. And how long did he stay here?
I don't know that.
Well, he
Was
was
it long?
he didn't live even a year after he was settled. I think it was 9 months or something after he was actually since he first came, but when he became the settled minister, he died within a year.
Right. And he's buried today in the old burying ground out back there.
A pretty tough job, huh? You only lasted a year. Okay, now, did they have, Suzanne, did they have music in these services in '69 too?
Yes, they would have had music. It would have been done by the congregation, and it would have been the singing of psalms. The Puritans had, many of the independents in England, besides the Puritans, had already had a practice of singing psalms that were put into metrical form, metrical rhyming form. In other words, they were taken from their Hebrew poetic forms and put into European poetic forms, and sung to a set of tunes that usually accompany the Psalter. And the first Puritans brought a Psalter with them. I believe it was the Ainsworth Psalter they brought with them. But the first Psalter that was published here was done in Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Bay Psalter, which Sam has a facsimile copy of it, that is a facsimile of the first Psalter published here. I want to say in the United States, but it wasn't yet.
Did you want to?
Oh, no, I just wanted to point that out. And that they would have been singing psalms in church, and the very first Puritans would have been literate. They knew how to read and they're educated, so they wouldn't have been lining the psalms out. But during the decades that followed, and more people coming, immigrating over that couldn't read, the process of lining the psalms out started, which meant that there had to be a song leader to call out the words of the next line, because they couldn't read it in their psalter. Now the people would have already known what tune. They would have just told them what tune, and they would have known that. But the lining out of psalms is one of the things that caused church to last a long time, besides the long, long sermons.
Okay, so they didn't actually have a music director that helped them sing these things in a melodious way.
No, if they were lucky, their minister might have a good voice, or they would have someone in the congregation who could serve as a song leader that had a good voice. But one of the reasons in the next century for the singing schools that sprung up was the fact that psalmody was degenerating because of these practices. If someone couldn't sing very well and was trying to convey to the congregation what to sing, well, the congregation sang it the way that they heard it. It might not be right. So finally, there had to be something done, so that's where the singing schools and the shape notes came in the next century.
And if I were sitting in this cold, drafty meeting house, what would I be hearing from Benjamin Estabrook or his successors, Peter?
Well, first of all, you could expect to be there for a very long time. You could expect to be in meeting for worship pretty much all day on what the Puritans considered the Sabbath, which meant that nothing else happened but worship on that day. The Puritans were, the Church in England itself was trying to find a middle way between the Reformation and the Catholic Church. And the Puritans represented the kind of far end of Reformation, and so wanted to do away with what they thought of as extraneous embellishments on the Christian faith and get back to the real thing. And so that's often what you would hear pure Christianity preached from a Puritan pulpit. One that emphasized very much, among other things, an understanding of Scripture, an understanding of theology. They were very literate people, and a lot of personal responsibility for your own salvation, I think, was emphasized in the preaching.
But this wasn't Calvinism that there's an elect and then there's a bunch of people who are in deep trouble.
I don't think that was the thrust of the preaching on a Sunday service. They really emphasized self-examination. They were constantly examining themselves for their sinfulness, but the emphasis really was on forgiveness and self-betterment.
Mm-hmm. How long would one of these sermons run?
A sermon itself would go for at least an hour, 90 minutes.
I don't think you could get away with it today.
I can't get away with a 20-minute sermon.
And then the readings were all biblical?
The readings were all biblical, and as we've heard, the Psalms were sung. And as the generations went on, it got longer because the song leader had to line it out for the congregation.
Mm-hmm. And what's this lecture day thing on Thursdays?
Well, like I said, the Puritans were, in their emphasis on, having a true understanding of the Christian faith, that you could knowingly and knowledgeably consent to. You needed to learn about the faith, and so that's what midweek lectures were all about. The emphasis was it was kind of like adult religious education of its day, which was really to an exposition of the scriptures mostly, but also of theology as well. The idea being that you needed to know what you were agreeing to when you owned the covenant.
Mm-hmm. And pretty much everybody went to Sunday service?
It was required. Attendance was required. As more and more English people settled here, though, there were fewer and fewer of the kind of strict, not strict, but those who had a regenerate faith, who had had a personal divine experience, born again kind of experience, and many people came here from England just to farm and to make a life, and so while it was there's nothing else to do on Sunday is the other thing, right? I mean, there was nothing but church, and they took the strictures of the Sabbath, of the Jewish Sabbath, and applied it to their own day, and so really there was nothing to do except go to church services. And so everybody went, no matter what their personal religious commitment was. It was something that everybody did.
Mm-hmm. Anything else in the 1600s?
Well, they built an inn. Remember, that was apparently happened in a lot of towns, including Lexington, that people needed some place to go between the two Sunday sessions in the church, and particularly in the wintertime, because they didn't believe in heating the churches. They thought that would be too luxurious. But people had to thaw out somehow, and so they had that. I think that the reason that the Buckman Tavern was built was that they said they needed an ordinary thing.
Built by a Muzzy around 1709, and it's also worth adding that when the town bought the common, while it was still a parish in 1711, I think, they bought the common from a Muzzy, from neighbor Muzzy, he was called in the deed. Benjamin Muzzy, and that's where we'll get to this second meeting house, but that's built on former Muzzy land.
And the second meeting house was built when?
After we have become a town, after we've been incorporated.
Oh, not until then?
Yeah.
Okay.
The situation seems to have changed. The historian of Cambridge, Lucius Page, a 19th century historian, has a whole lot about this whole process of the separation of the farms from Cambridge. And he seems to think that there was a kind of era of good feeling after the 1691 license to build the meeting house and so forth. For one thing, Cambridge had been very concerned about the public land that was still not owned privately, and that was an important financial asset to the town as they saw it. And the legislature, when they granted the farmers permission to build, left that land in the hands of Cambridge, and it was from Cambridge that they bought the townsmen bought the land that was the minister's fund, the Muzzy purchase and so on. And it was done in a very grown-up way, I guess I should say. The town appointed a committee, and the farmers appointed a committee, and the two committees negotiated, and the purchase was done in the proper way, and the farmers paid up, and the town saw that they weren't being robbed, and so on, and so things got to be a little more friendly. Someone donated a big, lovely new bell for the Lexington Meeting House, and the selectmen spontaneously, it would seem, voted to give the old small one to the farmers for their church, for their meeting house. So that was happening, and somehow it seems that both towns were growing and prospering. It's hard to, in some ways, to see how, because there was a war going on during those years. There were two wars, King William's War and Queen Anne's War, both of which caused rage by the French and Indians from Canada, but it doesn't seem to have prevented the economy from growing, and both Cambridge and Lexington were prospering. So when the people in the farms, this time it was called the North Precinct of Cambridge, when they decided that they wanted to separate and become a distinct and separate freestanding town, they petitioned Cambridge, and Cambridge said, all right, let's have a meeting, and they appointed some people, and both the committees negotiated, and it was settled in very amicable terms. So,
and now we've gotten into the 1700s.
That's right. This was in 1712.
And the great event of 1713, which we are celebrating this year, and Helen Cohen, the Minister Emerita of First Parish, is going to fill us in on the goings-on in the 1700s. Right now we have a meeting house, and we had a pastor for a short period of time. But Helen, what happened then?
Well, 3 years after Estabrook died, they had a committee. Churches had committees from the very beginning. Committees, very important part of church life. But
it was a town committee.
Yes, it was a town committee, but it was to hire a new minister. So they would go out, just the way our church committees do now, and look at some of the neighboring ministers.
Without email.
Without what?
Without any email. And
no email, no tweets, no twits, whatever. And anyway, they looked at a number of people, but they ended up hiring John Hancock, who is the grandfather of the John Hancock whose name we all know, who became a very important revolutionary figure. But in 1698, they ordained and installed Hancock as their minister. And the totally fascinating thing about Lexington at this period, to my mind, is that Hancock served the town as the minister of the only church from 1698 to 1752. And
54 years.
54 years. And even more unbelievably, after a short interim, when they tried various ministers out, they called Jonas Clark, who came in 1755 and served the church until 1804. So what that means is that you have a town that's had these two major leading figures who've occupied the leading role in the town for the entire century. So the entire 18th century, Hancock and Clark have been the major figures, and not surprisingly, I suppose, since they lasted so long, they were both great men and great ministers in different ways. But I wanted to go back to the fact that the town and church are so intertwined, which is something we don't think of these days. But Charles Hudson, who wrote early 19th century history of Lexington, wrote that the towns and parishes were so united and their duties in many respects so similar, so as you said, they're doing the same things, that it is difficult to draw the line between the civil and ecclesiastical history of the place.
Mm-hmm.
So they just had these major roles. Hancock was especially known as very dignified but warm, sociable, got to know his parishioners very well. He spent a lot of time just getting to know them and getting to understand what they needed from him and how he could work with them and what they could contribute. And above all, he was a peacemaker. And that's a term that was used by a lot of people to describe him. They describe a couple of stories. One case where two men were fighting over the property that they had, and they just would say, no, you know, I had that part, and the other one would say, no, I've had that part. And finally, Hancock went up with him to the place where the argument was focused, and he stuck a stake in the ground, and he said, Mr. So-and-so, you will not go beyond the stake from this direction, and Mr. Other so-and-so, you will not go past this stake from your direction. And that was the end of it.
And he had such a position in town, he was able to make that stick. And is that why they came to call him Bishop Hancock?
Yes, they called him Bishop. I think also because the churches were connected at that time. The ministers all knew each other. They all married each other's daughters and so forth. And they took part in each other's ordinations and installations, so they had a lot of connections. And Hancock, serving for 50 years, ended up ordaining and installing a great number of the area ministers. So in some ways, not that Congregationalists are supposed to have bishops, but in some ways, Hancock was a kind of bishop for this area during that time period. I wanted to tell you one more funny story, if I may. There were deacons in the church, that were lay members, but a couple of the people in the town heard that some churches had elders. And they came to Hancock and said, we want to be the elders in the church. And Hancock said, well, do you know what the elders do? And he said, no, they just heard it was an important position. And he said, well, the first elder has to prepare my horse for whenever I go out to ride around the town. And the second elder has to come with me and pay my expenses. And apparently that was the last time that anybody asked to be an elder in the church.
I would think so. Now, John Hancock, he lived in the parsonage, Benjamin Estabrook's house?
No, I don't know where he lived actually until 1730s, which is when the Hancock House was built at that time. Sam?
Well, in 1700 or so, he marries Elizabeth Clark, no direct relation that I know of to Jonas Clark, and they actually build a house on the site of this present one that we're in today, around 1701. And it stood just in back of the present house, back where the parking spaces are now. And that foundation was actually uncovered in the archaeological dig done here in the 1960s. And it appears that that house was attached to this one, which was built in 1738, for a couple of decades or so before the older house was demolished.
And who built this house?
Well, this house was paid for and built by their wealthy son Thomas, who had become a merchant in Boston after being apprenticed out at a young age, which was rather unusual for a minister's son to be apprenticed out to a common trade, but he made it very clear. Oral history, sometimes unreliable, but tells us in this case that at the age of 9 he made it very clear he didn't want to follow his father into the ministry. Whereas most ministers' sons back then grew up to become ministers and marry the daughters of other ministers. It was very much a family business. But in this case, Thomas is apprenticed out to a bookbinder, ends up marrying the bookbinder's daughter, and inherits his business, and then becomes a merchant, and we are told the wealthiest man in this part of the eastern coast, this part of New England. And so he's able to afford building this beautiful home, what was, for about 100 years, the nicest house in Lexington, as a gift for his parents.
I see. So John Hancock lived here thanks to his son.
Right.
He no longer was at the mercy of the town for his living quarters.
Right, and actually, going back even to 1700, we don't know who built that house for him, but we do know that he owned this land outright. He wasn't beholden to the town in any way for his property, which was also rather unusual compared to other towns.
Okay, so he has the woodlot and the hay fields as a source of income, but he has his own farm then.
Right, about 50 acres or so. And both he and Jonas Clarke were the ministers, they were farmers, they reared large families, in Clarke's case 12 adult children. Beyond that, Clarke was also a leading patriot, so they had a lot on their plates.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So by now we got a pretty good crowd, and we got our own town, and what do we do about the meeting house? We built a new
We built a
meeting
new
house.
one in 1713,
Okay, and this is the same place where the original one was,
very
pretty
close, I think
much.
a little bit farther back. And we appointed tithing men who went around and made sure that the boys behaved. That was a very important honor and office in the town.
Must have been a
Two
lot of
tithing
fun.
men.
I would love that. And the music that resounds in this new elegant meeting house.
Well, you still would have been hearing songs, but we're working gradually through the century to include hymns. And by the end of this century, probably there had been more hymns than songs. And the congregation was now becoming educated in music, not just, I don't mean congregation, I mean the townspeople. There were singing schools and singing societies springing up to try and teach people how to read music so that they wouldn't have to have the psalms and hymns lined out to them in church every Sunday. And these different singing schools used what's called shape notes. There are 6 different shapes to the musical notation. Like we use a round shape or oval shape nowadays. They had 6 different shapes that denoted 6 different scale degrees. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la. And they would see these and know what note to sing based on how far away they were from each other and what shape the note was.
But
So
we don't
you would have been hearing harmony, that means, in church.
Really? Yeah, okay. Well, but not a choir.
Oh yeah, a choir would have developed during that century.
Okay.
It wouldn't have been as important as in the following century, but choirs were developing. They didn't have organs in church, at least out this way. Some of the big, more bold churches might put an organ in. But really, the viols, which are the ancestors of the violin family, especially the bass or viola da gamba, it's an instrument that looks like a cello and it fits. It doesn't have an end stick, but it fits into the legs, and you hold it. It has frets on it, and it's played underhanded, not overhanded. That would have been the main instrument heard in church. That gives a good bass line so that nothing goes flat. And if there were other instruments, they could have been a tenor viol, alto viol, soprano viol.
And who's writing these hymns?
Oh, a lot of people were writing the hymns. William Billings is one of the ones that comes to mind right off. Oh gosh, I can't think of the name. It's a funny, Supply Belcher. People like that. That's why I couldn't remember his name. And the music would have had, just like polyphonic music in the secular world, the tune would not have been where we are used to hearing it, but in the top highest voice.
Mm-hmm.
It would actually be the 3rd voice down, the tenor line.
Mm-hmm.
But the way they sang the hymns was that any man or woman with a high voice could have chosen to sing either the soprano line or the tenor line.
Mm-hmm.
Any man or woman with a low voice could have chosen to sing alto or bass at whatever octave was convenient. So instead of 4 parts being heard, you would have heard 8 parts, all doubled. The 4 parts doubled at the octave.
What is it, pleasant to listen to? Or?
Yes, it's robust sounding music because of the strength that's given with the doubling of the octaves. It's pleasant. It could sound raucous and spare because they didn't think of harmony the same way we did, not exactly the same way. Things that we think sound like a resting place would have sounded to them like something that needed to keep moving and vice versa. So the sound of, I don't want to get too technical, but the sound of an open 5th with no 3rd in it, that would have been a good sound to them, and we would think it sounds unfinished.
Can I say a few more words about
Yeah, please.
Mr. Hancock?
Sure.
First of all, I think that later on, Peter is going to talk about one of the Great Awakenings. But there was the first Great Awakening was actually during Hancock's time in Lexington. And George Whitefield came from England, and there were all the itinerant preachers going around, and it was raising people's spirits. People felt that religion was stagnating in some way. And so what happened was that a lot of the churches would either be very resistant and try to keep everything just the way it was, and then some churches would go extremely in this new direction and become what Boston Brahmins called enthusiastic, which means being filled with God. But that was not proper. And what Hudson admires Hancock for doing is that he absorbed some of the spirit, and some of the, probably music was part of it, and other things, recognizing that the church needed this kind of energy and involvement. But he kept it within the bounds of reasonableness and rationality. So, I mean, that was a major, many churches were splitting over this thing, I think.
So he adopts and adjusts to it, but not succumbs to it.
Exactly. And I just wanted to close the part on Hancock with what Mr. Appleton from Cambridge said the week after he died, which was that he softened men's tempers and corrected their ill humors and brought the fretful, the angry, and the revengeful into a calm, peaceable, and forgiving frame. As you, and he's addressing the townspeople of Lexington, as you have had the reputation of being a peaceable people, I believe you will readily grant that it has been very much owing to the pleasant, prudent, and pacific counsels of your deceased pastor. He was eminently fitted for this place in its infant state, when you were few in numbers and needed a man of such wisdom and prudence to advise and assist you in your outward and civil as well as spiritual concerns. So
That's a lovely tribute.
it's a beautiful tribute, and there's a lot more of it. But
how old was he when he died?
he was 80 when he died. His son had served for a few years with him, Ebenezer Hancock, but he died.
Ebenezer Hancock, the assistant to his father, was meant to take over for his father when his father retired or died. But as you noted, Helen, he predeceased his father. But another one of the Hancock children died rather young, and that would be John Jr., leaving a widow and children out in Braintree, where he had been their minister, and it actually baptized John Adams and some other famous soon-to-be patriots out there. And his widow and children come out to Lexington, and they actually live here in this house with their grandparents, the Reverend John Sr. and his wife. Now, among these children who lives here for a few years in his childhood, around the 1740s, is John III, who is to become this famous Governor John Hancock, the signer of the Declaration of Independence. So this house in Lexington is the last surviving home of his.
And that's interesting. Then he ultimately, of course, builds his place on Beacon Hill.
Or actually, he inherits that from his uncle Thomas.
Oh, really?
Wealthy merchant, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who is this Jonas Clark that I hear about? Where does he come from?
Well, after the loss of this man who'd been minister for 50 years, they went for about 3 years looking around and trying to find the right person. And in 1755, they called Jonas Clark, who was a recent graduate of Harvard. And he came and settled in 1755, and as I said before, he stayed until 1804. And so he's minister during the build-up to the Revolutionary War, through the Revolutionary War, and into the next century. He was also a very sociable person, very inquiring mind, very committed to the idea of freedom of minds. And part of what I feel about these two ministers is a kind of openness and willingness for people to ask questions and explore, and being willing to have them make up their own minds, that they didn't have to force other people to believe exactly what they believed. But he very much got caught up in the idea of freedom, and when the British started doing the Stamp Act and the other things that in fact were a kind of tyranny over the colonists, he became an incredibly powerful voice for the rights of the colonists. And he got involved with people like Sam Adams and the John Hancock, who's part of the revolution. And he wrote many things for them. He ultimately attended the Massachusetts State Convention, which created a constitution that was one of the things that fed into the United States Constitution, which actually ended slavery. One thing we haven't talked about is the fact that there were in fact slaves in Lexington. So there was something like around 20 slaves at the beginning of the 18th century. And John Hancock, the minister, had a slave, but Jonas Clark never did. And so
The slaves went to church, and they sat with the free blacks up in one of the balconies,
yes,
as I
and
recall.
when they built a new building in 1793, they built a gallery specifically for free Negroes, as they were called. And we all know the famous story of Prince Estabrook.
Princess.
Probably belonged to the Estabrook family, who fought in the war and gained his freedom that way. And there was another slave.
Purdue, you know.
Whose name is not as famous. I never heard it.
I'm not quite sure why, but
But I think, you know, Clark had the idea of all people having the right to freedom early on, and played a role in getting that into the Constitution.
but he would never preach a political sermon.
Not true.
Not true.
He was obviously just a much more public person than Hancock. I mean, Hancock was very, very focused on his congregation, his parish. He did give some sermons outside the parish, but Clark was just ready to get out there in the world and make sure that his people were ready to fight for peace, for freedom. So he was standing there with them on the green, and he wrote an account immediately after that, or very shortly after that, in which he presented it in a way that I think it's not presented now, but it was much more, he said that Captain John Parker was telling them to disperse when the first shot was fired.
Yeah, true.
And he, of course, blames the British for the first shot. He is absolutely sure that the British fired the first shot, whereas nobody else in the world is sure who fired the first shot, whether it was British or colonists. But he talked about just how bloody and brutal the British were that day, and just opening up on the colonists, and then going through the town on their way back from Concord, and burning houses and killing people. And so he fired people up, and if you go to the monument on the green now, which was erected in 1799, when he was still minister, with funds from the state, the words that you read on that monument are Clark's words. And it just gives you a wonderful sense of the passion and fervor of this man for the new country.
You know, it's fascinating talking about the church and state thing, which I did when a few minutes ago in introducing this program. He was a major political leader in town. As the pastor, he would be, but he exercised that leadership, right? The British said if it weren't for the Whig New England ministers, we wouldn't be having this trouble. He was much more aggressive and outspoken than William Emerson in Concord was, for example.
Yes, he would. I mean, he was a real leader.
And he certainly played a role that famous morning in April when Hancock and Adams and Captain John Parker, the Minutemen, and some of the top people in the Minutemen Company, and Clark trying to decide what to do, knowing now that the regulars were out and that they were coming down the street, the Bay Path down Massachusetts Avenue, and we sit in Jonas Clark's study, and there are some Jonas Clark things around here.
There certainly are. And the most famous of which is this desk behind us here is Jonas Clark's sermon desk. Now he would have had two desks. One is the one you see here. The other would have been one that he would sit at, a knee-hole style desk that he would do letters and diaries. And I should point out that we actually have the majority of his diaries in our archives at the Historical Society today that cover most of his adult life and the Revolutionary War, and they're absolutely fascinating to read, even though they were just a line a day, so about the equivalent of a tweet a day in modern times, 140 characters or so. Anyways, this desk though was his sermon desk specifically because it was a standing desk. And we are told that Clark would pace back and forth in this room as he wrote his 1 hour, 2 hour long sermons. We do have some of them in the archives today, some of his sermons, although in total he wrote well over 2,300 sermons, I'm told, over the course of his 50 years here. And needless to say, he'd repeat a lot of them at different points in his ministry, because over the course of 50 years you wouldn't remember every single sermon. But
I never do that.
I should also point out that when it came to sending political messages in his sermons, he would oftentimes do it through scriptural references so as to perhaps mask the point or hide the point slightly, but still get it across to his congregation. And one example of that would be, I think, Helen, you referenced his 1-year anniversary sermon of the battle in 1776, and he's a lot more explicit as to what he means in that sermon than he is in others, but he uses these scriptural references such as there's some passage, whether it's Exodus or what, I don't know, but something to the effect of Egypt shall be a desolation, for they have shed innocent blood, and he takes that and he paraphrases it and he says, Great Britain shall be a desolation, for they have shed innocent blood. And he really backs everything he's got to say politically up with the theology of the time.
And he was a person apparently to whom the townspeople listened devotedly and responsively, and the selectmen and the town meeting would listen to him. He weighed very heavily his opinions, and over the desk
we've got a silhouette of Jonas Clark that was cut by his son when Clark was an elderly man, actually shortly a couple of years before he died. And it's the only picture that we've ever got, or that was ever made of Jonas Clark, actually. Because he always, oral history, to go back to that once again, says that he never wanted to sit still for an oil portrait to be painted of him. He thought it was a vain waste of time, and he was, well, he had a lot on his plate, as we've said, and he always felt he could be doing something far more productive. And in the back corner of this room, actually, we've got a set of concealment items, which was custom going back to the 15th century or more over in England, came across the Atlantic over to New England here in Massachusetts colony, and it was almost a sort of superstitious custom at first, and dated back to times when they would want to ward off the witches and the evil spirits bad omens from the home, so they would take one used shoe from every family member of the household, never a complete set and never a new shoe, and they'd put it into the wall of a newly built house. And that would protect the home and ensure good luck for its inhabitants. As long as they should live there, the house should stand. And in any case, how they came to be in this interior wall, you might wonder, but for a few months, that back wall there was actually an exterior wall before they added on the L a few months after this main house was built. So in there you can see we've got a lady's shoe with a high heel, we've got a men's shoe, that would be Reverend John Hancock's, and we've got, I believe, 5 little children's shoes from each of their children. You'll also see a early 18th century cartridge box. These were all items placed in 1738 when the house was built. And in other walls of the house, this was all found when we did our restoration in 2008. We also found a riding crop, some dolls' clothes, some coins. Fascinating what you find if you open up the walls.
Yeah. So what's he talking about besides the British being a bunch of heels?
Well, the preaching in most congregational churches and First Parish, in addition to the political references, tended to focus on the person of God the Father. The Puritans and the Congregationalists really were, in many ways, they harkened back to the Jewish roots of Christianity and had a very strong focus on God the Father. And in many ways, the switch to Unitarianism in the early 19th century was paved. The way for that was paved by this kind of almost monotheism of the Congregationalists. And that, and of course, the notion of liberty, and that every person needs to own the covenant and know what's in it and understand the faith. So there was a strong emphasis on literacy, religious literacy, as well as freedom, and a sort of a lesser emphasis on the second and third persons of the Holy Trinity, Jesus and the Holy Spirit. But very much focused on the sovereignty of God and the absolute transcendence of God were major themes for the preaching at the time.
Now, Jonas Clark wouldn't have been a deist as, say, Madison and Jefferson was, believing that God, the Creator, God, started the thing, but they believe much more in a God that intervened in human affairs.
Yes, they were not deists. They really did affirm the sort of biblical nature of God. The deists, Thomas Jefferson and others, were really influenced by the French philosophe, the Enlightenment ideas about the universe and about knowledge. The Congregationalist preachers of the time, less so, and were more likely to affirm a more biblical or orthodox idea about God. Although, like I say, with more of an emphasis on God's transcendence.
And did God have a plan for mankind and for each person?
Pretty much, yes. One of the spiritual practices of the time was discernment, right? So if there was a decision that needed to be made, you prayed about it because God had a purpose for you. But so that was an important aspect, was figuring out what was God's will for your life, and communally. No decision was made in the congregation without prayer and introspection.
More Abraham Lincoln than Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson, right?
Yeah. So, any other thoughts, comments?
I just had one quotation from the sermon, the election sermon that he gave in 1781. So the war wasn't over yet. This was an election sermon for Governor Hancock and the state and the legislature. And that sums up his beliefs about the importance of the social contract and the need to be a community, and that it's not about the individual so much, that that people had to help each other. So it was a mixture of freedom and responsibility, civil relationships, and compassion, all put together. So what he wrote was that without government and laws, the weak would be devoured by the strong, the innocent, like righteous Abel, would become an easy prey to the vicious, ambitious, and abandoned, and the longest sword must determine the fate of the world. Hence it appears that under God, the supreme ruler, this wise institution, this richest of blessings, takes rise from necessity. So in other words, government is absolutely necessary in order to protect the weak and make sure that everybody has freedom. And all men by nature are free, equal, and independent. And it is in compact, and in compact alone, that all just government is founded. So he's taking the Puritan ideas of community and responsibility and covenant and saying this is what is absolutely vital to our survival and our growth and flourishing.
That's fascinating, and that's the Declaration of Independence. And of course, Jefferson was criticized at the time. They said, hey, Tom's a nice piece of work, you write well, you know, but gee, you're not saying anything new in here. And Jefferson says, no, I didn't mean to say anything new. What I was trying to express is what Americans believe. And this is evidence that he was absolutely right, because here's this country parson in New England saying in his words just what Jefferson was to say some years later.
Confess to him, blessed his name, because Jehovah he good is, his mercy ever is the same, and his faith unto all ages.
Well, Sam and I decided that given the location, and again our warm thanks to the Historical Society for making the Hancock-Clarke House available for this part of this special edition of Lexington Remembers, we thought that it would be appropriate to wear colonial garb. And this isn't costume stuff. This is, in fact, the kind of clothes that they would have worn, and that we wear on the green in April. Sam is a member of the Lexington Minutemen Company, and as am I. They would have grabbed what they had on the hook behind the door and gone out there that morning. They didn't have a uniform, of course. No. This is just the clothes they wore. And so we thought this would be a good time to wear them.